This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine. This little light of mine, I'm gonna let it shine, let it shine, let it shine, let it shine. Welcome, Talk Catholic, the website.com, your host, Tim Kilcoyne. No agendas here, just the straight and narrow, through Mary to Jesus, the Catholic faith proclaimed and preserved. Hope to see you here every week. TalkCatholic.com, Tim Kilcoyne, in the Easter spirit, which, like Christmas tide, doesn't stop right after Christmas. Likewise, Easter doesn't stop right after Easter. Let's keep our joy going, ladies and gentlemen, contrary to all the evil around us, and we know there is much of it. I was just thinking I like to share my personal experiences. Do you like to share your personal experiences? The theme that we are covering is on honesty and lying relative to our 8th commandment. And I just wanted to relay, I was with an individual who was very much versed professionally in finance. And I was very interested in getting the person's take on the signs of the times, the climate in which we're living. And this person gave a very technical kind of answer that, well, the markets always allow for a 6-point-something correction and that things run in cycles and it doesn't make any difference whether it's the Democratic Party or the Republican Party in power. This is just simply what the science says as to market fluctuation. And I was taken back by such a dry technical perspective, especially in light of what I was trying to get at and going a little bit below the peripheral. And I suggested that we could be well at a very pivotal point in human history, not just American history. We don't know. What we do know is that a lot of things have happened to our country in the past year alone that seems to be moving us away from our anchor, our constitutional and moral moorings, let's call them, the grounding of our country. And I'm going to speak to that in just a second. But what I really was trying to get at is that the turbulence of the times is not only reflected in the political sphere, but the religious, especially within our church, and so much of the confusion that we have spoken to, a la Ralph Martin's new book, A Church in Crisis. And I always like to share the Marian messages, especially the third secret of Fatima, which we don't really have an absolute definition of, but we have a pretty good sense that it has much to do with the apostasy and out-and-out rebellion, i.e., take a look at what the German bishops have been doing lately on the part of the leaders within our Catholic Church. This was very much predicted in some of our Marian messages going as far back as 1631, Our Lady of Prompt Succor, and reflected in the messages of Our Lady of La Salette in the 19th century, and especially defined at the Fatima event, those messages given to Sister Lucia in particular to relay to the world as the other two children went to their heavenly reward at a very young age. Sister Lucia lived to a ripe old age, and yet the last public interview that she was given, I believe it was 1957 or 58, and she was not allowed to share that secret with anybody in a formal public way after that. Interesting. And the reason, more than likely, is that it reflected on the clergy, on the cardinals, on the Pope, that this is where some of the confusion and division and rebellion and apostasy would indeed emanate from. Well, in any event, I was simply trying to make my spiritual point that there's a whole nother interpretation to the fluctuation in society that we have witnessed in the course of the past year especially, that I don't think the markets have calculated. And that indeed, either we could be looking at the simple downfall of another age-old civilization. According to Cal Thomas's book, America's Expiration Date, it's about 200 slightly plus years. That is about the hourglass for most civilizations. Tragically, our country is right on the clock. Or something else is in the works, all part of God's plan, and that we should be mindful to not build up our treasures on this earth, and that we should be preparing ourselves for getting ready for something much more magnificent and important for your salvation. I don't think I got my point across to this financial counselor. What was, in fact, almost scary was the kind of expressionless, inscrutable, almost blank look to all of what I was saying. And this was a very intelligent person. And this helped me to reflect on some of our previous themes of other shows about the age of indifference that we live in. Just Whatever is the name of the book, according to Matt Nelson. I was really stunned whether there could be any interest later on with a little more elaboration. I don't know. But the worry here is that history seems to be lost on the part of our younger generations. I'd like to quickly read from a book, The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past by Jarrett Stepman. And he refers to President Ronald Reagan in his farewell address. Reagan feared that a generation of Americans were raising their children to be ambivalent about their country, and that popular culture was not interested in filling the gap. He says, if we forget what we did, we won't know who we are. I'm warning of an eradication of the American memory that could result ultimately in an erosion of the American spirit, he said. Reagan's words went largely unheeded, and what he warned about is coming to pass. The failure of our schools and the indoctrination in our universities has left the millennial generation, for all its technical savvy, with little appreciation of America's past, which it dismisses as benighted and contemptible. There is a spreading belief that the men who built this country were oppressive and their values irredeemable. The purveyors of this view argue that we must transcend the ugly ideas, principles, and even people of the past to perfect our society. We must transform America by wiping out what previous generations celebrated as exceptional, but we know to be damnable. This is not a matter of honestly recognizing our ancestors' shortcomings, while humbly acknowledging that our own descendants will recognize ours. These militant and self-righteous activists have instilled in their fellow citizens a fear of being labeled bigots and have cowed the silent into inaction. One by one, the great men once universally revered by Americans are becoming reviled or forgotten. Casting aside our heroes is dangerous enough, but we also risk losing something even more essential. The activist target is not only historical figures, but the ideas and values that define America, and I would add, ladies and gentlemen, our Christian heritage, especially Catholic. Christopher Columbus, for instance, was once celebrated as a uniting figure. The discoverer of the New World represented the spirit of exploration and adventure that is in our national DNA. Columbus is now tied to the original sins of a wicked American civilization. Activists are trying to pull down his statues and abolish Columbus Day. This giant of history deserves better, but the anti-Columbus crusade is about more than Columbus, the man. It is about the undermining of what he represents, the world-changing transatlantic migration that brought Western civilization to the Americas and led to the establishment of the United States. That Western civilization, ladies and gentlemen, is Judeo-Christian. To finish up, Jared Stepman says, it's not hyperbole to say that the American Revolution was the defining moment, not only in American history, but in modern world history. Yet it and everything it stands for are under attack. More of us must be willing to say, enough. But to defend our past, we will have to relearn what was once universally known but is now forgotten and neglected. If the foundational principles of our country are to be put on trial, they at least need a fair representation in the court of public opinion. Human history is brutal and full of tyranny. We lucky few who have been privileged to be born Americans have a great legacy to uphold. If we wish to pass this legacy to future generations, we must be able to defend the men and the ideals that got us here. Fewer and fewer are willing to defend what built this country. Those who want to erase our history will not stop with century-old statues. They want to expunge not only Confederates or Christopher Columbus, but the essence of American civilization. And I, again, remind you, that means Christianity. Our history, culture, and institutions have been under assault for generations, and the American elite have failed to defend them. In fact, the elite, the masters of Hollywood, the mainstream media, and our education system are leading the charge. Relating this all back to my encounter recently with a financial counselor, I simply wanted to get a little bit more up to snuff on the world of finance, a subject matter that I'm more or less clueless about in some respects. But I knew one thing. In order to get up to snuff, I needed to trust the person that I'm going to be engaged with about the subject. And therefore, it was more important that I met with this person over coffee to just find out who they were. And I was going to gauge whether or not this person's values were at least in the galaxy with my own. Because if not, then we would be forever interpreting things very differently, like all of the turmoil of the past year, and what our appropriate response should be to it all. So there is no divorcing the spiritual from the temporal. People want to do that, but it's really a good thing to try to figure out whether the person is like-minded and like-hearted so that you can have a like vision. And if there are huge differences on that moral platform, you can rest assured that you're going to be drawing very different conclusions about what the truth is. And that is our task always. Why do you think, for instance, so many parents sent their kids off to get a liberal arts education at 18, 19 years of age and spent a heck of a lot of money doing it? Because they wanted the child to become an adult and be well-rounded and well-versed in our heritage, our history as to who we are as a people. At 18, 19, most of us don't know what we're going to do with our lives. What's more important at that age is to know who came before us, what actually happened, and how did we get to where we are, and what does God want for us now in light of our knowledge of His world. I had a fascinating experience recently in stumbling across a video on the internet by a Father James Keller, who is the leader of the Christopher movement back in the 40s. And so I took a look at this particular video called You Can Change the World. Check that out on YouTube. And then I decided to buy his book of the same title. And I opened it up and I was absolutely astonished about what he was referring to, because it was absolutely parallel to what Jared Stepman was just warning us about. And this was 1948. Let me read. On page 24 in You Can Change the World, Father Keller says, "Those who fall for the attractive deceptions of the materialists," and he's referring to communism, "are not merely those who are economically insecure. In far greater numbers, they are those who have no spiritual moorings, no fixed beliefs in the fatherhood of God and the dignity of man. If this steady trend toward paganism continues, it is only a matter of time before our nation will collapse, more from deterioration from within than from any force without." This is what took place in Germany. Nazi Germany he's referring to. But thank God, in the United States, it is not too late to reverse this trend. It is not too late to do something about it. This is 1948. It seems safe to say that less than 1% of the American people are set on the destruction of our country. Furthermore, there is little danger of exaggeration in saying that every one of this tiny minority has a militant hatred of the immutable truth on which our nation is founded, that man is a child of God and is endowed by his Creator with certain unalienable rights. Also, you will invariably find, once you investigate, that practically all of this minority are in key spots where they pass on their hatred, not to a few, but to the mass of people. This is so because those who have an active hatred of God are missionaries at heart and are never content to keep their hatred to themselves. They strive to incessantly pass it into the bloodstream of our national life, defiling the minds and hearts of everyone they can reach with their foul ideas. Father Keller said earlier in the book that these major influential spheres include education, government, labor management, and media, newspapers, magazines, books, radio, motion pictures, television. His ultimate answer is for us as disciples of Christ to go into that marketplace, into a job of his or her own choosing, without fanfare or flag waving, without doing anything sensational. His or her simple task is to insist on truth where others are intent on furthering falsehood, to establish order where others are spreading confusion. Where there is hate, he tries to bring in love. Where there is darkness, he carries light. The big need is to encourage people with good ideas to go into the marketplace rather than to concentrate too much on driving out those with evil designs. One of the best ways to get rid of weeds is to plant something in their stead. Ladies and gentlemen, is it any different today? Let us pursue that on the other side. This is WQPH Radio 89.3 FM. I'd like to continue here with Father Keller. This book is so prophetic relative to the task at hand before us, I believe, right now. He says, the strength of American life is rooted in Christian truth. The basic teachings of Christianity are in its bloodstream. The first Americans acknowledged this. With but few exceptions, they were men of deep and reverent faith in the supernatural. They believed in 1, the existence of a personal God who has spoken to the world. 2, Jesus Christ, true God and true man. 3, the 10 Commandments. 4, the sacred character of the individual. 5, the sanctity of lifelong marriage. 6, the sanctity of the home as the basic unit of the whole human family. 7, the human rights of every person is coming from God, not the state. 8, the right based on human nature to possess private property with its consequent obligation to society. 9, due respect for domestic, civil, and religious authority. 10, judgment after death. Thus, these early Americans set the pace in acknowledging the fatherhood of God and the brotherhood of man. And what was good enough for them should at least represent minimum good for us. Their beliefs were good enough for our founding fathers who, right in the beginning, wrote these words into the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. The founding fathers, you see, were most explicit. They were God-fearing men. They took pains to emphasize that fact, that the natural law itself depends on God. And in the very last sentence of the Declaration of Independence, they strengthened their affirmation of our dependence upon God by adding the words, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence. And then Father Keller refers to a paper that appeared in the Journal of the American Medical Association January 3rd, 1948, and it's referring to Cardinal Bellarmine from 1576, as he expressed very similar thoughts 200 years before the signing of the Declaration of Independence. He said, all men are equal, not in wisdom or in grace, but in the essence and nature of mankind. Political right is from God and necessarily inherent in the nature of man. It depends upon the consent of the multitude to constitute over itself a king, consul, or other magistrate. This power is indeed from God, but vested in a particular ruler by the council and election of men. This is not a new doctrine, either to the founding fathers or to Cardinal Robert Bellarmine. They well knew it had come down through the long centuries. And we know, ladies and gentlemen, that this is the Judeo-Christian faith in its common denominator form. It's all from the Bible. Then listen to this. Again, the prophecy is amazing. Father Keller suggests, try this if you will. Go into any group, the more prosperous and fashionable, the better the test, and speak of the self-evident truth that all men are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Say to this group that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men. We venture that you will be startled by the number of people, particularly the younger people, who do not know that you are quoting the Declaration of Independence. And of those who know, a large number will not agree with the philosophy expressed. And of those who agree, and this is the most tragic thing, many will not have the courage to say so. With this situation staring us in the face, this is 1948. Is it any wonder then that the godless have taken on the job of rewriting American history to fit the doctrines of Karl Marx? Wow. Did he see cancel culture in a crystal ball? Fake news really is fake news in every era, because the falsehoods of Marxism and atheism and materialism are always exactly that, false and evil. You don't believe that lie, he says. I don't believe it. The mass of the American people don't believe it, just like today. But too many of us are lulled into a conviction that the problem will take care of itself. It will not, and it cannot. He says the sun needs no inscription to distinguish it from darkness. Even those who have little or no time for religion are beginning to see. They are beginning to realize that the evil forces that have risen up over the world in the last few years to crush them have worked even more furiously to stamp out Christianity, because it alone has the light of truth. It alone is the one universal cause that champions man's dignity. They are beginning to see the falseness of the subversives, their claims of wanting to protect the people, to relieve oppression, to provide freedom for the laborer. They are beginning to see these hypocrites just as Christ himself saw them. They are beginning to see that all the godless follow one pattern, namely to deny or ignore the sacredness of the individual so that the state may become supreme. What do you think Father Keller would say about the mask? I rest my case, Your Honor, Christ Jesus. It is time to take back our country and our church. History doesn't repeat itself. We have just witnessed, just by providence alone, that I found this book from 1948. Unbelievable. The same creepy scenario of the godless, the self-hating guilty, dominating the airwaves. The minority few squeaky wheels at the town hall meeting, the squeaky wheels at the school committee, the squeaky wheels on TV. Do they not know how to make life miserable for the many? Unless the many rise up for their own personhood. Atheists and agnostics, calling themselves Catholic, in fact, indeed masters of deceit, dominating the places of influence, even though they constitute such a small percentage of the American population. They have tremendous influence unless checked by that overwhelming good majority, who I know I'm talking to every single week. You are the answer. As Father Keller would say, the only answer is to have more and more bearers of the truth, especially in those phases of life which, for better or worse, fashion the destinies of men: education, government, labor, and communications. Put enough people who are fighters for the truth in each of those fields, and the rest will take care of itself. That is the answer, and there is nothing original about it. It is as old as the hills, he says. As soon as there are more people turning on the lights than there are those turning them off, then the darkness disappears. We will be a Christ bearer and his light. This is WQPH Radio, 89.3 FM, doing our best to sanctify the secular. Have a great week, everyone. And don't forget to let your Easter light shine. Let your light shine. That is what it's all about here at WQPH Radio, 89.3 FM. But we need to hear your story. You want your voice to be his voice. That is making the faith known to others. Please, my number is 877-625-3727. Tim Kilcoyne, TalkCatholic.com. Say, Mother Teresa told us, your ministry is your work right where you are. Grab on to this microphone. God bless.